I've been seeing a lot of posts going around on these things. These are neutral density filters, or ND filters, and people talk about them as something called like an anti-Jello filter. And that idea seemed too simple to me. So I kind of started doing a little bit of research to understand what an ND filter is, what exactly it's supposed to be doing to kind of reduce Jello, and why and how it should be used, especially for mini quad flights, especially with a GoPro. The ND in ND filter stands for neutral density, and what that really means is that it's going to neutrally or equally block all waveforms of light across the entire light spectrum. So really all that's saying is that it's sunglasses for your camera, right? It's going to exactly and evenly block light across the entire spectrum from entering your camera lens. Now, you know, there are other kinds that will block out like just the top half or the top third, which might be your sky, or will change or block out certain kinds of light that's, you know, in that waveform, in that spectrum, but a neutral density filter equally blocks it all out. ND filters also come in a variety of different strengths. It can range from 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and I'm sure it can even go higher. And each of those steps corresponds to a certain stop of light. Now, if you're not familiar with camera terminology, just bear with me for a second, and we'll talk about what stopping up and stopping down means. But before we get into all of that, we have to understand some very basic principles about cameras. Now, if you're not interested in cameras at all, this video might not be super interesting to you, but if you're interested in kind of understanding a little bit more about the kind of behind the scenes of how these cameras are supposed to be helping us make better and better videos, you might want to stick around because this could be interesting. And you might already know it, and in which case I'm sure that the comments will be filled with, oh, you totally don't understand this, which is probably true because I've learned everything from the internet and I've never done anything with in school for cameras or anything like that. But here is what my basic understanding is. One of the most important parts when you're shooting video or shooting pictures is getting your exposure right. If you let in too much light or too little light, you're going to be ruining your image and you're going to be losing data and making that information unrecoverable, meaning that if the sun is bright and the ground is dark and the ground is adequately exposed, you're going to lose information because the sky is just too bright and you won't see the clouds or the sky or any kind of contrast. This opposite could be true, right? You can be exposed, for example, for the sky, and you won't be able to make out different things on the ground because it's all too dark. So setting your exposure right is one of the most important parts of camera work. Now, there are 3 parts of a camera to be able to set exposure. You have your f-stop, you have your ISO, and you have your shutter speed. And these things all relate to each other in a different way, so I'm going to oversimplify how they all work. The f-stop changes the aperture. It's called the aperture of the camera. It changes the amount of light that can be let in or out of the camera. And as you change the aperture, you change the depth of field, right? So I'm shooting this with a very shallow depth of field so that I'm in focus and everything else behind me is gone. It's not gone, but it's out of focus. It's not there. And that's because I'm shooting with a low aperture with a wide open lens. And that will relate to the stoppage here in a second. The next one is ISO, and it's basically like a digital enhancement of light. It is a digital way of adding more light to your image. To oversimplify, the lower the ISO, the better, because as you increase ISO, you're increasing the amount of noises that is going to show up in your video. You can notice that, for example, when you use your cell phone and take a video in the dark, it gets really grainy and nasty. That's because the phone is cranking up the ISO to better compensate for the fact that not enough light is making it into your camera. Finally, you can change your shutter speed. Now, the shutter speed affects things a lot more in your still photography, for example. If you're shooting sports, you shoot at a very high frame rate so that it goes and you get all of that information without any blurring or anything as fast as possible. You want it to get into the sensor. However, if you're shooting something that you want to be a little bit more serene, a little bit more beautiful, you slow that shutter speed down and increase the other parts of your thing. But basically, the short version of shutter speed is that the higher the shutter speed, the less light is going to make it to the camera, and the lower the shutter speed, the more light that's going to get added into the camera. And so you have this catch-22 of increase my shutter speed, I'm going to have to decrease my aperture, and if I decrease both, I need to increase my ISO. And you can see how these things play off of each other. Okay, so all that to say, setting your exposure right is the most important part of taking stills or taking video. Now with the GoPro, you only have two of those options. One of them is shutter speed and one of them is ISO. The aperture on a GoPro is fixed, meaning that there's no way to increase or decrease the size of the aperture, which means that you cannot use changing the aperture or stopping up or stopping down. I said I'd come back to that. I really meant it. Stopping up or stopping down the amount of light that's coming in. So you have to control the light with ISO and shutter speed. Now, for the most part, we take our GoPro and we put it in auto mode. And what auto mode does is it says, I want to keep the ISO as low as possible, which is great, but I'm going to increase the shutter speed as high as I can. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, and it gives the GoPro a very distinct look. It's very sharp, it's very crisp. It works much better in bright light and works much worse in dark light. Once it runs out of the ability to increase the shutter speed to let more light in, it starts to lose image clarity because it's adding ISO to compensate for it. Now, where does an ND filter come into this? An ND filter is a way to change and control the amount of light that's making it to the camera in the same way that you would use aperture to control the same values. If you're shooting video with a camera where you can control aperture, you're going to expose by setting your ISO as low as you possibly can. You're going to choose the shutter speed that you want for the shot, which we'll come back to again in a second, and then you're going to use aperture to change exposure to suit the needs of the shot. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, and if you want to have a certain aperture value, meaning I want this very shallow depth of field outside in the bright sunlight where there's a lot of light, I need to have my aperture value very low, which is increasing the amount of light that's getting in, which means I need to stop down that light. And that's where the ND filter comes in. Okay, I hope you're already confused because I sure as heck am. So now, all of that coming together, what exactly are we doing here? Well, there's another thing that I want to tell you about, and that's called shutter angle. Shutter angle is this principle that refers to very old school cameras that actually used a shutter that spun around in a circle. And it made more sense for that. But essentially you can think about the shutter angle as a ratio between the shutter speed and the frame rate. Now, generally speaking with GoPro, we shoot at 2.7K, that's the resolution, 30 frames per second, which is the frame rate, super view, flat tune, all of that stuff. We know those values already. So now, why would we add an ND filter on top of that? Well, you might have noticed that the best footage, or the footage that you're used to getting on a normal basis, comes from sunrise or sunset. And the reason, one of the big reasons for that, aside from, like that just being a beautiful time of day, is that the exposure of your GoPro suits those times of day best. What happens is that the GoPro is able to increase the shutter speed, leave the ISO low, and capture footage in a more natural perspective. Now, what does more natural mean? So coming back to this discussion on shutter angle, there's this magical ratio between shutter speed and the frame rate. When you set certain shutter speeds in response to certain frame rates, you're able to create different kinds of looks and feels for the video that you're producing. Generally speaking, you want to be at a 180-degree shutter angle. Well, that doesn't make any sense because we don't have that kind of shutter. But essentially what that means is that you want your shutter speed to be roughly double your frame rate. So we generally shoot at 30 frames per second. We want to have our shutter speed be 1/60 of a second. In the same way, if we shoot at 60 frames per second, we want it to be 120 frames per second. When you set your shutter speed to correspond to your frame rate, you're going to get the most natural look and feel for your videos. And you can recreate that sunset, sunrise experience, the natural look and feel of the video at any time of the day using ND filters. An ND, so when you take your GoPro and you force a 130 or a 1/60 shutter speed, and you force 30 frames per second, and you force the ISO to stay low, and you go out to shoot in the bright daylight, it's going to look like crap because everything's going to be way overexposed. That's where the sunglasses come in. That's where you take your ND filter and you set it over front of your glass, and it's going to allow less light in, but it's going to keep that same shutter speed and that same frame rate and allow you to get that smooth, that glossy looking video. But what happens if you change the shutter angle? For example, you can shoot at 1/30th shutter speed and 30 frames per second, and you're creating a 90-degree shutter angle. And what that does is it increases the amount of motion blur, and it makes the video seem even more fluid, and some would argue unnaturally fluid. So if you go out and you shoot 130 frames per second, or 1/30 shutter speed at 30 frames per second, you're going to see everything starts to kind of, it becomes like a dream sequence, which there's a look for that. There's a time and a place to shoot video that looks like a dream sequence. When you increase that ratio by 2 to 1/60 shutter speed at 30 frames per second, you get a very natural look and feel. You get what people call a cinematic look. That's the ratio that cinema cameras are shooting for when they're, when you're capturing footage. And anything higher than that is what you're used to seeing. All of the image is extremely sharp. All of the pictures, all of the edges, anywhere that's not the focus of your flight is going to be very sharp. And there's a time and a place for that. Again, it doesn't look bad. I'm not saying it doesn't look good, but when you want to make a natural looking, natural feeling video, you want to expose right ahead of time and get your shutter angle to that 180-degree mark. Now, all of this is finally coming circle to, why do we call it an anti-Jello feature? Well, because we're shooting at that shutter speed, that 1/60th frames per second, what's happening is that it kind of helps all of the image smooth out a little bit. It increases a little bit of motion blur on points that are moving through the image. So as you're flying through the air, what's like dead front instead of you, what's dead in front of you is going to be extremely sharp, and the stuff that is whooshing past is going to, it's going to increase that effect of motion blur. And because we're inviting motion blur to come into our shots by putting the ND filter on, by lowering our shutter speed, it reduces the amount of Jello, because any micro oscillations in the camera are going to be hidden by that motion blur. So, in a roundabout way, an ND filter really is an anti-Jello feature, but there's a lot more going on, and I think it's really interesting to kind of look into why it makes things work differently. And I think it enables us as content creators to kind of think about, how do we take these principles and create things a little bit differently. If I'm going to go out and make a really smooth, juicy flight with, very little flips and that kind of stuff, but I'm just cruising around, maybe I want to shoot for a 90-degree shutter angle with 1/30 shutter speed with a 30 frames per second, and increase that motion blur and increase that feeling of kind of just woo, but at the same time, maybe I'm shooting an action scene, where I'm chasing a mountain biker down a mountain. I want to get really, really crisp images, and I want to shoot at a very high frames per second. And then there's another reason to choose a different shutter speed and to expose differently using ISO filters or not. So, all that to say, ND filters are Jello filters, but they have a lot more power and can help you control your video in a much different way.